Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast. We are on the second leg of the island tour. Welcome to Kirkwall. Yeah, thank you so much for being here at the Orkney Distillery in Kirkwall. This is the Islands Tour, sponsored by SSE, and here in Kirkwall we're in association with Scottish Sea Farms, for which we're very grateful. Lots to discuss throughout the course of the evening, and of course the whole point of this Islands Tour is to bring to life the concerns, yes, but the opportunities that are on the table, that are right there for island communities around Scotland. And frankly, and you know, I'm not going to beat around the bush here, to send a message to the politicians that do listen to this podcast, some of whom are in the room tonight, about what the islands need and what they're not getting right now. We're going to have a big conversation about all of that. Of course, this podcast is nothing without Geoff Aberdein, who was Alex Salmond's Chief of Staff when he was First Minister. Hello, Geoff.
Hello.
Hello. And Andy Maciver's here. He was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
Hi. Great to have you both here, of course. Shall we start with how we're feeling about being in Kirkwall? Andy, this is your first time here.
It's my first time, actually. Been to the Western Isles many, many times, probably 100, I would say, with family there, and been to Shetland a fair few times, but my first time in Kirkwall, and the first time on Holyrood Sources that we've had boy band mics. So listeners will not know what's going on here, but when it comes on YouTube later in the week, people will realise that Geoff and I are ready for sort of a flying without wings Westlife type scenario if things get out of hand later on. Actually, you will remember on an overnight STV broadcast for an election, I don't know, a long time ago, Rona Dougal made a reference to you and I being like boy bands, and you named us what?
No Direction.
Correct. So I'm getting strong No Direction vibes here
it's
tonight.
the high stools, I think.
I think it is.
And the standing up when the key changes. Geoff, how do you feel about being in Kirkwall? You've got personal connections to Orkney, don't you?
I do. Very, very loose connections. But a family holiday, my father loved to take us to Jersey on family holidays, and I was 10 years old. And we stayed in the Merton Hotel in Jersey. And our family befriended the Glue family, who I believe run the garden centre in Kirkwall. And I can't remember which sister it was.
Oh, no.
Wait, I'm not going, no, it's not like that. Wait a minute. I was 10 years old, Liam, come on. I had my first ever kiss on the lips, not a French kiss, a kiss lip on the lips from, I think it was Kirsten, but it could have been Rachel. And I just had the time of my life. I'll never forget it. That was a real awakening moment for me. So if the girls are still around, thank you for that wonderful moment.
And the chance to have such a personal...
And you might be here tonight, I don't know. So
such a personal connection.
My fiance's going to love this story when she hears this podcast.
Oh, my days.
It's like a risky version of the Famous Five books.
There we are.
Oh, goodness me. But we are very glad to be here. It's lovely. It's a very busy time in Kirkwall. I've heard many, many stories since arriving of all the shows that have happened over the last few days, the agricultural shows. There are a few hangovers in the room tonight, I think, as a result of those. Yep, I'm looking at you. As a result of those last few days of shows as well. And actually, it's so busy that we are all staying in different hotels all over the place. We couldn't all book together, although I think that's worked out better for some of us than others.
Yeah, I arrived earlier than the minister and at Kirkwall Hotel, beautiful hotel. And they said that they had a one suite and one non-suite. And I said, well, these ministers get lavish treatment everywhere they go. So I've got a beautiful one-bedroom suite overlooking the harbour, and Ivan McKee is in a cupboard. So
Yeah. So there we are. Good. So thank you for having us. We're really glad to be in Kirkwall this evening. It's really, really nice to be here. Right. If you're not familiar with the podcast, we talk about Scottish politics and UK politics as well, to be fair, when it's relevant to Scottish politics and policy making. And so we want to start the podcast just by doing a bit of that. It is recess. at the moment, but there's still stuff buzzing around. And actually, Geoff, where are we at? How is this recess functioning? I mean, are recesses ever memorable? I'm not sure. But what's your take on where things are at? We've seen riots in England and in Belfast. We've seen a Labour response to that. There is still some announcements going on. What's your take on this
Events, dear boy, events. It's been a tough start for Keir Starmer because of these riots. And I have sympathy for him, because you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, and he has to come up with a strong response to that. And it hasn't been all plain sailing. And I think added to that, if you think of Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor's statement, which is very honest in fairness, but I do wonder if that could have been communicated a bit better. Apart from the public sector pay, which is something that we would expect a Labour government to take forward, it was quite doom. I mean, I watched it going, bloody hell, things are tough, and I just wonder if there could have been a little bit more a nod to the future to say, but things will get better, trust me. And I just think that was a little bit of an error. And all of this is really important, of course, because the 2026 elections, and that'll be Keir Starmer's first electoral test. Yes, the local elections in England and Wales, but Scotland, the Holyrood elections. And if you asked me a few weeks ago, I would have said that Labour are almost home and hosed, because I do think the SNP are in a lot of difficulty. I'm second-guessing myself just now. I think Anas Sarwar is going to find himself in a position having to defend a lot of difficult decisions that his bosses at Westminster take. Now, the SNP, in response to that, they've got a conference coming up in the next couple of weeks. They have a programme for government, John Swinney's first programme for government. They've had time to reflect. They've had time to mourn the losses of lots of their colleagues. They need now to act, and they need to be bold, and they need to seize the initiative. And so they have an opportunity. I'd still put Labour as favourites for 2026, but I do think the SNP can make a good fist of it. And I think John Swinney has to do that in these big statement events that he's got coming up.
Of course, Andy, the other thing that is bubbling away during this particular recess is the Scottish Conservative Leadership Contest, which we've talked about a bit on the podcast over the course of the last couple of weeks. But there's now a notable intervention, just today in fact, from James Cleverly, who is running to be Conservative Party leader. He has been the Home Secretary, he has been the Foreign Secretary. I mean, during musical chairs, who knows what job he didn't do. But James Cleverly thinks the Conservatives can win at Holyrood in 2026. Do you agree with him?
It's funny what people say during leadership contests, isn't it? It's really hard to be polite in responding to that. Look, when devolution began, the Tories were third, behind effectively two parties of the centre-left with a vote share in the teens. When devolution was 10 years old, they were third, with a vote share in the teens, behind two parties of the centre-left. On May the 7th, 2026, the Tory party will be third, behind two parties of the centre-left, with a vote share in the teens. I say in the teens, their vote share was actually less than 13% last month. Worst vote share they've ever had. There is no mathematical or political possibility of the Scottish Conservative Party being in government after the 2026 election, or after any election that I can envisage in the future. It's just not an option.
So why did why did he say it? Because that's not helpful. Well, surely that's putting a lot of pressure on his colleagues that are standing for leader. Why say it?
You're going to see...
Nobody believes it.
There's a long history of UK party leaders saying that sort of thing, because it's, at the moment they're not appealing to anybody outside the Tory party membership. So north and south of the border, they've got a leadership election on both places, which I don't think has really ever happened before at the same time. So they're not trying to appeal to anybody. Look, political party membership of all political parties is a pretty awful cross-section of society, right? It's not an entirely normal thing to do to be a member of a political party. But all they're trying to do at the moment is to appeal to those people. They're not trying to appeal to the normal person in the street. Yeah. So obviously they say things that are ridiculous, like, of course the Tories can beat SNP and Labour in the next election. And also...
There isn't a Tory party member in Scotland that truly believes that they can win the next Holyrood elections.
I think you're wrong about that.
Really?
Yes. There are also SNP members who think we'll be independent in the next 3 years, and they're wrong about that too. So, these are dyed-in-the-wool, emotional political party members, Tory party members. Of course there are people who think that. And that's who he's appealing to. And even if they don't think that, they like the fact that he says it. Right? and you will get the 6 candidates for the Scottish Tory leadership. They'll be saying things like that as well over the next month. Of course they'll be saying, yes, we're the official opposition. Yes, we can win the election. Yes, we can beat the SNP. They're all going to say that. None of them think it.
Yeah.
But of course they're all going to say it.
Fascinating. That's politics, isn't it? We'll try and dig into some of that. By the way, in news that will surprise no one, I was interviewing Mel Stride, who's another candidate for the Conservative Party leadership.
He is.
Whenever that was. 10 days ago, I think I was speaking to him. And I asked him who he would most like to work with of the candidates in the Scottish Conservative leadership race. And oh my days, if you would like to hear a politician's answer, that was it. He didn't have a clue.
Yeah.
Frankly. He said something along the lines of, oh, well, I don't want to interfere in my Scottish colleagues, blah, blah, blah. And I fell off my seat. I was so bored. It was just terrible.
There's a long history back in the days long ago when I worked for the party. The biggest date in the calendar, because the Tory party was obviously very London-centric, the biggest date in the calendar is when the UK leader came to Scotland. That was a big PRD, right? I know we knew it was going to be a disaster, of course, but that was always a big PRD. But we always knew that the first question that somebody would ask, one of the journalists would ask, say, can you name your economy spokesman in the Scottish Parliament? And they'd be like, oh, God. Absolutely not. So that's really all they got briefed on when they came up, was these are the names of people.
Yeah. It's
it would be nice if you got them right and then got back on the plane.
And your role at this point was Director of Communications for the Conservative Party.
Exactly. That was a win. That was a win at that point. So, yeah.
And the Scottish Conservatives are still third behind everybody else with a vote share in the teens. Thanks to their Director of Communications.
In the tweens.
I'll tell you one thing, and a serious point on this.
Yeah.
Okay, the Liberals' vote share didn't do anything, it stagnated. But they won some seats. Now, if the Conservatives in Scotland go down a route, in my opinion, of following Reform UK and align with that rhetoric, I think Alex Cole-Hamilton, I think Liam McCarthy might be pretty pleased with that and might come through the middle, and it's a real risk for the Tories. They've got to watch that.
So that is a serious point, and on that, so what is basically going to happen here is that the two contests work differently north and south of the border. The MPs contest for the UK leader, the MPs will whittle it down to a final 2, and the membership will choose the most right-wing populist person in that final 2. Right, and even if the Scottish leader doesn't particularly want to follow that, it doesn't matter, because there's no real history in Scotland of a Scottish Tory vote being influenced by the Scottish Tory leader. The Scottish Tory vote gets influenced by what's going on with the Tory party UK-wide. So even if the Scottish leader doesn't want to go in that direction, the wind is going to take them there anyway. That's just how it works. So what you've identified is going to happen. That's the reality. I think the Lib Dems have got an awful lot of work to do to spread their support, to deepen their support enough to get more list seats. But somebody's going to benefit from it. Even if it's not.
This is the sort of conversation you get week by week on the Holyrood Sources podcast. Now, though, let us pay attention to beautiful Kirkwall. We're at the, and Orkney more broadly, we're at the Orkney Distillery. Over behind us, the harbour of Kirkwall. It's a lovely, lovely evening. There is actual blue sky, not like when we arrived earlier and we were bouncing all over the place on that plane. But it's a really lovely evening, and we're really glad to be here. Now, by way of kind of introducing Kirkwall, introducing Orkney to our listeners, I want to welcome a couple of people before we get to the MSPs. I want to welcome friend of the podcast, Kat Headley, who is from Orkney, who was a Scottish Labour candidate in 2016 in the parliamentary elections, and is no stranger to listeners. Kat, great to see you. You shuffle your way in. Should we give Kat a round of applause?
It's tight, by the way.
And at this point as well, I want to welcome Sasha Wright, who's the director of the Strategy Collective, to join us as well. Thank you, Sasha.
It's tight.
We've made it nice and easy to limbo around the microphone stands here this evening. Great to see you both. Thank you so much for being here. Kat, shall we start with you? The kind of broad concept of why we're doing this is we want to talk about the challenges, yes, but also the opportunities for our island communities and how that should link up and how that should engage with politics. I suppose just give us a sort of broad thought on what that means to you.
Well, it's delightful to actually all see you all in person after a few weeks of during the election of seeing you just on squares on the on a laptop screen, and I was so delighted when I heard that you were going to come here, and I'm even more delighted that it happens to be when I'm here anyway for the wedding of my great friends Sharon and Sean, who are here this evening.
Congratulations.
It is, by the way, that is an absolute first to have a honeymoon on the Holyrood Sources podcast. I mean, we are very grateful.
I'm just really pleased that her name's not Kirsten Glue. That would have been a real disaster.
I mean, Orkney's small, but it's not that small. So, I was born here, grew up here, but have now lived away from here longer than I did live here. And I don't know, Calum, if you're another islander, and that is always a weird thing. And I sometimes come to the point where I'm like, can I really call myself an Orcadian anymore? I now have hay fever, which I never had before, which basically means that you're allergic to the countryside, which definitely means I've lived in a city too long. And I sometimes wonder whether I'm, from Orkney, but Edinburgh is my home. But the boat pulls into Stromness, and I know that Edinburgh is where I live, and Orkney is my home. So I'm absolutely delighted that you guys are here, and that's my worlds kind of colliding in one. So although I think that tonight you could, when you get into the audience participation section, you're in for a robust conversation. Because the Orcadians love nothing more than a robust conversation, particularly when they feel like they generally don't get to be part of it. There is a lot of things happening in Orkney just now, which feel, I suspect, by a lot of Orcadians that is being done to them rather than that they are being part of. And things like renewable energy, a lot of wind farms and things like that. And I think the opportunity is I was thinking a lot about what I might say this evening in the last few weeks about a lot of things that are happening now. And I think that opportunity, but also the movement of people, is something that will always define our island community, whether you're talking about United Kingdom or whether you are talking about Orkney. My paternal grandfather was Guyanese. He came to the UK during the Second World War and moved his mixed-race family from Fife to Orkney. And there are probably people in this room who were taught by Edwin Headley. There we go.
Including your MSP.
And that is part of my story. But he was, not only a teacher at the high school here, he was in the Masons. We have the photographs to prove it. But the opportunity for him and his family to the kind of life that they were looking for. But equally, when I was growing up here, the opportunity that I was looking for was away from this island. I love the privilege of coming from here and getting to come back here. Now, although about 10 years ago, I realized that whenever I come back, I'm dressed like a tourist. It's great. There's you're going to have a lot of conversations about, because it feels like a pivotal time for Orkney right now.
And people coming and going is an interesting thought. Sasha, let's welcome you into the conversation, because you have got huge amounts of international experience in financial services. You did that for a number of years all over the world, I understand, and you came back to then start a business here and help other people start their businesses too, especially women.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And so I was born here and brought up here, again, went away, lots of opportunities. And when I had my first son, I really just wanted to be back home. So came back. As you know, there's no major financial institutions based in Kirkwall. And so I had to make it up and kind of work out what I was doing. And when I was traveling, a lot of the time I would meet wonderful, mostly women at the play park, great businesses, but maybe something that was just slightly not working for them. And realize that, with a little bit of help and a little bit of support, you can turn businesses into something that's much more profitable and rewarding for those women.
And that's amazing, because you're helping so many other people accomplish something that is so important to a place like this. And I suppose then the question is, our umbrella question is, there are opportunities, but there must also be challenges in trying to do that.
Yes, massively. And I think, I'm sure today we're going to talk about housing. We're going to talk about all the challenges around that. We're going to talk about that because, in actual fact, trying to get people here, and we've got more jobs than we've got people. So how do we get them here? In terms of skills as well, you want to be able to get people in and raise those skills, but it's really difficult. And when you're growing a business, there is a point in time where you think, is the risk too great to be headquartering it in the islands, which is where you want to be, or is it that you're going to have to really start getting resources from outside of that, and then therefore looking at Edinburgh, London, those types of places.
Yeah. And I suppose then, just to finish off this introductory part, is do you feel represented by politicians? Do they work for you and people in this community? Sasha, let's start with you.
I think. Yes, I think they try very hard to, but I think it is different. We still have really fundamental issues, and one of them, particularly as a woman, is childcare. And so, I come from the Connected South Isles. We do not have one childminder in the actual connected aisles, and that's because a lot of them are working at the nurseries. But the nurseries only work, some of them only work in school term time and school hours. So trying to have a full-time job amongst all of that is incredibly difficult. And so I think sometimes we talk about some of the complex issues about women getting funding and all these other areas, when in actual fact there are some of the primary issues that if we solved, you could really attract lots of women back into the workplace, but also give them proper salaries.
Kat?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of Northern Ireland, because they have a relatively, as we've touched on, a rare experience of electing Lib Dems.
Ouch! The lesser spotted Lib Dem.
Consistently, though. And there is a feeling that as a result of that they get ignored by central belt parties. I remember the first public debate I ever spoke in as a candidate was during the independence referendum, and I was speaking for Better Together, and there was a woman who basically, her position in relation to independence partly was because, the Parliament, that's just down the road. And I was like, well, not if you're in Orkney. The distance that the Central Belt feels if you are in Orkney or other rural communities in Scotland can feel as distant as London. Yeah. So that distance and that feeling of disconnect, I think, is something that is still a problem that devolution has not actually solved, and is probably one of the reasons why they elect really good Lib Dems. Consistently.
If you're in any doubt that there's going to be an attempt at a Labour-Liberal coalition after the election, listen in.
That is an issue, and I think it's a little bit different where we were last month in the Western Isles, because that is effectively a competitive SNP Labour seat, which has changed hands. There is definitely a pre-election issue, whether it's Labour or the SNP in power, and there are people, strategists and policy people in those parties, who will even subconsciously say, what's in it for us up there, because we're not going to win that seat anyway, because the Lib Dems are so entrenched in both of these seats, in Holyrood's case and in the single seat in the case of Westminster. And but I think what has to turn that around is that, and I think it slowly will happen, is that they start to realise that it's not just about Orkney and Shetland, it's about what Orkney and Shetland will be doing for everybody else further down the road. And then they'll have to recognise, and they'll have to do more. And I think that hasn't existed to this point. It has been easy to ignore and easy to forget, I think, at this point.
Just, if I may just add to that point, because, I worked for the SNP when they made the breakthrough election in 2007, and a massive narrative that really, and I think I said this in a previous podcast, that really emanated at the time was Central Belt bias. Now, I was from Aberdein, and that's a lot further south than here, but it's still a lot further north than the Central Belt. And Labour didn't manage to ever really address that issue. And if you look at the history of the SNP through their only successful years, that was the first time they ever won an election, a national election. There was that feeling, this lot don't care about us up here. And that's one of the big challenges that Anas Sarwar has on his hands, is to evidence that he will speak for all of Scotland. And I think that's going to be a huge debating point between he and John Swinney at the next election.
There is I won't dwell on this too long, but there are examples of when the influence. So Liam will remember with the ferry funding, with the inter-island ferry funding in the minority government, it came to the point where they needed you, and then you get something.
And the ferries are a
when they need you,
big thing right now,
So,
which is
you know,
another topic that will come up tonight.
that'll come up tonight.
There's precedent of, there being a bit of weight.
Necessity of that representation. I get you. Sasha and Kat, thank you both very much. It's great to see you. Thank you. Okay, now let's see if the applause holds up, because we're going to introduce the MSPs. Please welcome this evening, and we'll introduce them one by one so they've time to shimmy in behind the microphones. First of all, Liam MacArthur, Liberal Democrat MSP for the Orkney Islands. Nice.
It's going to look really good on YouTube.
Done very well, I know,
Yeah, professional.
If someone can turn this into a GIF, that would be great. Also with us this evening, we're very pleased to have Ivan McKee, an SNP MSP and also the Scottish Government Minister for Public Finance. And also with us, Daniel Johnson, Labour MSP and Labour spokesperson on the economy, business and fair work. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for being here.
I think we should have got marks out of 10 for, an Olympic style for the way we navigated the microphones. Just for the next podcast.
You had the easiest task, to be fair.
Just because I made it look effortless
You were
doesn't mean that it was
you were
easy.
doing the break dancing, others were doing the pole vault.
Yeah, that's true. Under single transferable vote, you're first out.
Thank you all for being here. It's great to have you, and we're really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have this evening. I actually want to dive straight in with renewable energy, which is something that's come up a lot with people that I've spoken to in advance of getting here this evening. And I suppose this is very much under that banner of challenges and opportunities, I think, Liam. It almost goes without saying that island communities stand to be at the forefront of Scotland's renewable energy generation. But it feels like it needs to be said over and over again for fear that communities lose out in some way.
I'd certainly agree with that. I think Kat's right. There's certainly challenges that come with this, but I think this is evidence of the point that was also being made before, that for many in the Central Belt, and I exclude Daniel and Ivan, who I've always taken a broader perspective in terms of the way issues, legislation, etc., impacts in different parts of the country. But this exemplifies why the islands are, in a sense, an engine room of the wider national economy. I mean, we see it in energy. We've seen it in energy for many decades through the oil and gas sector. We're seeing it in the transition to renewables. But we see it in the food and drink sector. We see it in the tourism sector. See it in the creative sector. We can see it in so many different sectors. There's a lazy impression that the islands, that rural parts of the country, in a sense, are the places that need to be subsidised in order to be sustainable. What we need to be is invested in order to develop the potential and deliver that potential, not just for ourselves. And it does. It takes a very particular mindset, either to choose to remain in the islands or to move and to live and work in the islands. But we're under no doubt at all about the potential we have to deliver for ourselves, for our own community. But we've always recognised that isolating yourself off is the last thing you want to do as an island, and being connected to Scotland, to the rest of the UK, to Europe and internationally is something I think down through the centuries, Orcadians, Shetlanders and those from the Western Isles as well, I think I've got a proud tradition in doing.
Yeah. Ivan, do you feel like the Scottish Government is paying attention?
Oh, definitely. I think, and I would say it anyway, wouldn't I? But I really do. And I'm sort of listening to this thinking, yeah, I can understand if you're sat here, you're looking at some things and saying, well, we could benefit more from some aspects. But I'll be honest with you, you go to most parts of the country, you'll get the same narrative, and I get it every day in Glasgow about everything's Edinburgh-centric, and you'll get the same in the North East, you'll get the same, you go to the South West. So it's not something that's unusual. Having said that, of course, islands do have specific challenges, but huge opportunities. And Liam's absolutely right, because the engine room is absolutely the correct way to put it. The renewable energy opportunities that stand before Scotland are vast, and it's a real test over the next few years how we best exploit those to the advantage of the country. But it's the islands that are absolutely at the forefront of that, and it's how that we're able to ensure that those benefits, the investment happens, and Liam's right, and that's about how you invest to generate that turn, and how that, as much as possible, that stays locally, to encourage people to support that transition, which is absolutely central to the whole Scottish economy.
And Daniel, could Labour do that better than the SNP?
Yes. No, in all seriousness, without going for the very
coming, everyone.
Limbo's on the one mic, and only is a yes.
I think if you ask a closed question, expect a one-word answer. Look, in a sense, Scotland's economic challenges have been the same for a very long time. We are a country with a small population, but a very large landmass. So it's, in fact, in some ways, the islands just exemplify in really sharp focus what is an issue across vast swathes of Scotland, north and south of the Central Belt. But actually, if you look at the challenges that we have in front of us, especially around renewables, some of that is an extraordinary advantage. So we have a very high concentration of industrialisation in the Central Belt, but coupled with huge offshore renewable energy capacity around our coastline, and other things that the coastline, thinking about the salmon fisheries as well, with your local sponsor. The task is to join those things up. The task for any economic policy is about joining up your assets. But critically, as we face the transition, we really have to look very squarely about how we join that concentration of industrial capacity in the Central Belt with the energy capacity we have on our around our coastline.
Yeah, and a lot of this is about how you understand quite a sophisticated level where the economic opportunities are in different parts of the country, and then you major on those. And there's quite a lot of work done on this in the National Strategy for Economic Transformation and the regional economic partnerships and the regional strategies, economic strategies that have come out of that. And you've got south of Scotland, they'll talk about obviously their rural economy, how they digitise agriculture and how they build on natural capital. If you look at Edinburgh, clearly financial services have got a key role there. Obviously the North East, you're looking at the oil and gas and the transition. And in the Highlands, you've got, as Liam said, you've got food and drink sector that's hugely powerful and a lot of potential, and obviously renewable energies, creative sector and others. So it's about understanding which parts of the country have got those strengths, and then it's about majoring on those on the international stage to bring in the investment that helps to support that. And frankly, sometimes we fall into the mistake of pretending everybody could be great at everything, which isn't the case.
Here's where I think it's a bit different, right?
No.
Nah, wait a minute. Without any offence to my Glaswegian friends, this is actually, I think there's more of a case for fairness and equity. So if you're in Glasgow and saying we get nothing here, I think there's a fair argument to say, well, you're not a net contributor, right? So I think here, and in other islands as well, and it's incredible.
That's a great political slogan to take into Glasgow. Daniel, say that. If Labour go in saying you're not a net contributor to the next election,
are you putting in for political asylum in Orkney?
Can I also just be clear to Daniel that if he does bring in mayors, I'm not running for mayor of Glasgow? Right? Yeah.
That much is clear.
I've not done the polling, but I wouldn't fancy your chance.
It's the Truth podcast. But you have a situation in the three islands are now very much more similar than I think they ever have been before in terms of the assets they've got and what they produce. You have a situation here where people will look out of their window at a wind farm, right? And at the transmission lines and the interconnector that take that electricity down to the mainland. And then they'll look at their kitchen table at some of the highest electricity bills in the whole country, and they'll say, I don't get that. That doesn't seem like that's fair for me. It's not equitable. It's just not fair. And I think this is actually about balance. I don't think that people in the islands would say, well, it's all ours, right? And you can buy it off as Glasgow and Edinburgh. I don't think it's that. It's about where the fair balance is. And I think a lot of people would say that not only is onshore not fair, but with offshore even less so, because there's almost no benefit at all to local communities from offshore. Now, I would be clear, this is not the fault of developers or anybody involved in the industry. This is bad setting of rules. This is a problem with the rules of the game. They don't work properly. And I think ultimately they don't work properly now for island areas, but they will soon not work properly for anybody, because people in places like this will say, we've had enough and we're not doing it anymore. And then the whole country's got a problem.
Yeah, I echo what Andy's just said, but I like to put these things into perspective and or rather just give an adequate reflection of what the scale of the opportunity is before you match that to the challenge. So I've said in previous podcasts, if you add in the cluster of supply chain companies in the northeast of Scotland, the port developments that are underway from Montrose, Aberdein, Peterhead, Fraserburgh, Ardeshir, Cromarty, Nig, Invergordon, add in Stornoway's new £50 million port, and what the Lerwick and Orkney and wider Shetland and Salmond Voe have to offer. You can listen to Ed Miliband and you can listen to Keir Starmer saying we're going to get to net zero very quickly. The green energy is the way forward. Well, I'll tell you something. You cannot do it without those places I just mentioned. You have got the whip hand here. You've got the whip hand. So you've got to speak as one. And I'm urging all my colleagues, as you know I do, to form some sort of caucus, a political caucus, and speak as one. Yes, disagree about all sorts of manners of things, but agree on the scale of the opportunity. And the point of that is, of course, is because of the challenges. And I spoke to Anne and Elspeth earlier on in the drinks reception, and by God, I got taught a lesson there. But they were absolutely right, okay? Because they're sitting there going to say, what benefit are we going to get out of this, Geoff? What benefit are we going to get out of this? So let me just take one example very quickly. Broadshore, ScotWind development that's been awarded, still needs consent, still needs to get into AR6, a UK government funding now, still needs to get grid connection. But here are the commitments. 127 million on the development, 428 million in manufacturing and fabrication, installation 312 million, operations and maintenance 62 million, a total of 832 million on one development. Now that's not too far from the shore of which we are here. What are you going to get from it? And that's what we need to ensure, that there's economic benefit from. Economic benefit in terms of jobs. And then finally, when you have SSEN building pylons across your mainland, if that happens, make sure that there is a long-term community levy, not just for big one-off projects, but in perpetuity, every year for this year going forward, and then try and ensure that there is sustainable community benefit. And I was talking to Elspeth earlier on about, would we want to reinstate the abattoir here to make sure that premium gold, Orkney premium gold, becomes a thing again? Do we want to use that funding for road equivalent tariffs? Much better, sustainable, incentivised travel. Because if you're going to have to go through this disruption, make sure that you have the benefit that goes with it as well.
Liam?
I would certainly agree with that. I mean, I think there's still an issue about the extent of the development. When I say that Orkney has massive renewable potential, yes, it does. Do we want to exhaust every last bit of that potential? I would suggest no, because there are competing interests that come into play. We're already seeing in the offshore sector discussions with the fishing industry and concerns raised with the fishing industry about spatial squeeze, etc. So the resources that we have, there are different pressures upon them. These are islands that have benefited from tourism, but again, the benefit of that, as we've seen an increase over the years in cruise traffic, has put pressure on our resources, on our services, on our infrastructure. So I think there's always a debate to be had about the extent to which you want to absolutely squeeze every last ounce out of the potential you have. But I think Geoff's absolutely right that there was a learning process that went through in terms of onshore wind about the community benefit. And frankly, a number of the initial developers were pretty fast and loose in screwing communities to the ground. And what they got out of it was pretty marginal. With successive developments, I think communities have learned, they've been supported in the negotiations with developers, etc. I think the sort of infrastructure that Geoff's talking about, clearly you're not generating from those, but the need for that ongoing community benefit to be there in perpetuity, I think is now absolutely unanswerable, because these are communities that, yes, get an economic gain probably from the job creation, etc., but there's pressure on housing that was being mentioned before. And the investment in that will need to be paid for somehow, and it sure as heck isn't going to come from government coffers anytime soon.
Yeah, really interesting conversation. I, for one, would like to hear from Anne and Elspeth, but I don't know if they're willing to chip in. I think they're looking at each other. Is it these two women over? Shall I come over to you?
I can say they weren't shy about half an hour ago.
Let me see if my
Geoff
cable
was slightly
will
worried
stretch. Thank
at
you
the
very much.
demand for an abattoir shortly into the conversation.
Hello, hi. I'm sorry, I don't. Anne and/or Elspeth.
I'm the Anne.
You're the Anne. Anne, what were you schooling Geoff in earlier?
I attended the Orkney Heritage Society meeting recently. They've been fronting, as the only body, it seems to be in Orkney, that's fronting, the concerns I think very many Arcadians have about what one of the audience that night called the industrialisation of Orkney. That appeared in an article in the Arcadian the following week, and I must admit I was deeply concerned about what the change in the appearance of Orkney would be with these enormous pylons. I listened with enormous interest. There were a great number of people who had been deeply involved in all of this over the last few years. I actually felt ashamed that I hadn't taken a deeper interest in it, because I'm born and bred and had my whole professional career in Orkney. And I felt very, very concerned about the effect it was going to have on not only the community, the look of it, but the effect on it. What benefit was there going to be to us? There was going to be an enormous effect in that there's a big workstation planned in Finstown. That is going to have a big effect on the availability of skilled tradesmen within the community. We only have a certain number. It's already been alluded to earlier tonight that there are more job opportunities than there are the skills available in Orkney. But deep down, it was that feeling of, are we being exploited? Are we going to gain anything from this? I remember, I'm old enough to remember, the oil industry coming to Orkney. That was wow. And it brought my generation back to Orkney. Of course, now it's regarded as it did dreadful damage, but at the time, the difference it made to Orkney was substantial. The renewable energy industry has brought my children back to Orkney, and what I want to see is Orkney benefiting in a way that everyone benefits, and apart from anything else, we don't see what's happened apparently in Shetland in the look of the countryside, because we can't lose that. Of all the things, please don't let Orkney be industrialised.
How do you feel? Yeah. I wonder, Ivan, if we should put that to you. I mean, Anne spoke really powerfully there and said, are we being exploited? That's her question.
Well, I think it comes down to getting that balance right. And Liam's made this point already. It's about understanding that there's this huge potential here. How do you leverage the benefits of that? And then how do you make sure that locally as much of that stays here as possible? And there's a whole range of opportunities within that. The jobs, attracting people back, the investment that follows from that, how you can help direct that, the community benefits that can come from that. But all through this process, it's about how do you get that balance right. One of the responsibilities I've got in government is for the planning system, and that's all about that balance. It's about how you manage the economic aspects of what people want to invest in, how do you deal with environmental aspects of that, how do you deal with the net zero requirement, how do you deal with what local people want to see, and making sure that that balance happens. Now, people can debate whether individual decisions or in aggregate things are made rightly or wrongly, but you'll get as much criticism for too much development is not enough development, but that is part of getting that balance right, and it's hugely important that the systems are in place to do that, but that the economic value stays and is seen to be staying and is seen to be here for the long term, because that's what helps people support that development.
It's very interesting and very pleasing to see the people who are at the heart of these matters in Kirkwall. As you said, it's the first time. Some of you have been endlessly to the Western Isles, but it's the first time you've been here. You're saying, oh, it's very, very important to get the balance right. You're the man at the centre of this. Tell us what you're doing to get this balance right. I mean, it's not for us to say, oh, please make sure this happens.
Well, the way the planning system,
what planning restrictions and permissions are in place and what needs to be done to protect rural communities like us who have small councils, not huge staff to deal with this under severe pressure, which clogs up our whole system, not large and small. Our developers of housing are bunged up because they can't get permissions through. Our small staff is having to deal with enormous issues. And you're saying, oh, we must get this right. Please tell me, how are you getting it right?
It's not my job and it's not the government's job to make those planning decisions unless they're referred to us. In the vast majority of cases, those decisions are made at a local level, and that's exactly how it should be done. The planning system, NPF4, is in place that articulates what the different factors that need to be considered are. People have made the planning application for something they want to do. Obviously, it's open to people to object to that, and locally, the decision is made on the planning application as to whether they want to approve that or not, and that's exactly how it should be. Those decisions should be made locally. The point you made about the resource in the planning system, you're right, the planning system is under stress and does need more resources into it, so the steps we're taking to support more people being trained into planning, to review the planning process to make it as streamlined and as efficient as possible, to look at the fees that are charged to large developers to make sure as much money is coming back into the planning system to support the resources to fund that. There's a whole series of steps in place to help put further resource into the planning system to help unblock, as you're saying. But, as I say, those decisions should be made locally, and that's absolutely right, that should be the case.
Let me just say, if I may, Anne, that I think Anne does not look overly satisfied, Ivan, with that response. And I think that's a fair interpretation of your facial expression, and I appreciate that. The only thing I will say is we've got lots to get through, but there is time after the podcast for you to continue the conversation. It's an issue to which we will return, for sure, in future episodes as well. Go on, Andy, just round this
Yeah,
off
I just
us.
think briefly on this, so the word exploited is a really important word. It's not the first time I've heard it. I've heard it in Shetland as well, and I've heard it in the Western Isles. And I think one of the reasons why we were keen to do the Islands tour, and one of the reasons why we talk about the potential for some sort of caucus a lot on the podcast as well, is that I think collectively we probably didn't feel that the political class in the Central Belt really properly understood the fork in the road that we're at here, in terms of that balance, in terms of that fairness, and just how potentially wrong we're getting it, particularly over the last few years. I don't think I think the Green Coalition did not in any way help this, I have to say, in terms of that sort of urban-rural balance. But if you look at something like offshore, for instance, and the options fees for offshore wind. That's a really, really sore point on the islands. Every single penny of that went to the Scottish Government in Edinburgh. And I don't think anybody realistically thinks a whole lot of it came back. And I do think that ultimately, again, I don't think it's right to criticise the developers. I think ultimately this is a rules issue. This is about needing to rewrite the rules of the game.
So two very brief points. So this is a really important discussion. And I think, first of all, we are building assets that are of extraordinary value. And I think what's really important is that communities get their fair share of that. And that means that community benefit schemes can't just be tokenistic. You're asking communities to host big, ugly bits of infrastructure, if not permanently, certainly for very long periods of time. So it has to, the communities have to get their fair share of that economic benefit. But the second thing I would say is, look, we are going through an extraordinary transformation in the way that we generate our energy and the way it's distributed, moving from hydrocarbons to an electrified economy. And frankly, I don't think politicians have done a very good job at all of having the public discussion about what that will mean. And some of that will mean very big bits of infrastructure being built in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see it. And I think we have to have that discussion. I'm not saying that necessarily I know which bits are necessary and which aren't, but some things like that are going to have to be built in certain places around Scotland. And I think unless we're honest about that and have an open discussion, we're going to just brew up really big problems as a nation.
Let me just quickly, I want to endorse it, and that's actually very brave of what Daniel's just said, because he's absolutely right. And this problem doesn't just pertain here, you know. So the transmission network exchange that I just mentioned will go right from Buchan into Buckie, parts of the Highlands, down through Perthshire, Aberdeenshire, into Tayside. Okay. So this is an issue that's going to impact all of Scotland. It's a massive, massive issue. Absolutely no doubt that every single community impacted needs to feel the benefit. But Daniel's just touched on something. We have not been honest at all about this. We talk about getting to net zero. We talk about this green energy revolution. I'm massively supportive of it, just as I'm massively supportive, incidentally, of an oil and gas industry until this stuff is available at scale, because we are generations off when you think planning and consent that has to go through and port infrastructure instantly. But we need an honest conversation about what this actually means. And I don't think our political classes have been honest with that. And it's a 10, 20, 30-year thing, incidentally.
Yeah. It's really clear that this is a big issue. Thank you, Anne, for speaking so well and so passionately. We really, really appreciate that. That's why we're here. This is what we want to talk about. I do want to there's lots that we want to get through. And by the way, just so you know, we talk about energy a lot on the podcast. And I think that is right. That is a good thing. For this exact reason, it is clearly important, and it's important all across the country. So I'm really glad we're able
We've
to...
also used the word caucus on this podcast more than anybody else in devolution's history.
And folk call us a shorter version of that as well. Sorry, but we would take that out. I thought that was quite good.
No, we can leave it in.
All right.
Should we move on? It's actually a word that's come up a little bit already this evening, infrastructure. And I think this came up, again, you know, we deliberately try to structure these things so we're talking about what you want to talk about. And actually, somebody sent this question. This is Francis, who asks, when are we going to get new ferries in Orkney and a service that allows residents to take their cars into town and not always be on standby, in inverted commas? Ferries are of vital, vital importance to island communities, and Francis has just received several nods and hmms from around the room. So it feels like this is a big issue. Liam, why is this an issue? Why are the ferries so problematic?
Well, I think because of a lack of forward planning over decades, frankly. I think there's probably a degree of ownership that the initial Labour Lib Dem coalition needs to bear with this, but it's continued under successive SNP administrations, and we're now at the point where the opportunity, in a sense, to procure and build the number that we need year on year to avoid the sorts of problems that we've been hearing about, most notably on the West Coast. And I think I wouldn't want to diminish those, but I think what it has is masked the extent to which some of the very same issues have affected the internal ferry fleet here in Orkney. That actually the opportunity to procure and build those ferries in a time frame that allows ferries that are 30, 35 years and more old and well beyond what was expected to be the lifespan are being kept in service at the cost of the reliability of the service for the lifeline that they provide for island communities. I mean, it's difficult to think of an issue that transport, and particularly ferry transport, doesn't affect in some way, whether it's in terms of delivery of health, delivery of education, allowing the economies to function, the social interaction, whatever it may be. Transport's at the very, very heart of it. And the ferries continue to be the kind of engine room of that, both in terms of passenger, but also importantly in terms of freight transport. And what we're doing at this stage is keeping vessels in service beyond their lifetime. So the amount of planned maintenance is getting more extensive and more expensive. But you're also seeing unplanned maintenance where ferries are then off the routes for periods, which is also costing a lot of money, but is causing massive disruption. And I think in terms of the depopulation of the islands, which we've seen here in Orkney, perhaps less so than in some other parts down the west coast, But we're seeing that, and that very often is driven by the fact that people feel they just can't continue to live the life they need to live, relying on a service that just isn't there for them when they need it.
And it does feed into so much. I was overhearing a rather loud American group discussing this earlier on today. So the ferries were off this morning, is my understanding, because of the bad weather. And this group of, I think it was 4 or 5, perhaps 5, who were travelling around Scotland were now being moved to a later sailing later in the week. And they were then struggling to find accommodation that they could then actually add on an extra couple of nights. And I think there's some dispensation, isn't there? We all know this. Sometimes the weather is bad, and that means the ferries can't sail. And there's a bit of an allowance in people's own psychology, I think, for that. But then when there are these other sort of man-made, in inverted commas, issues that crop up, actually that is when patience goes like that.
And you know, so Liam mentioned the West Coast. The average age of a CalMac ferry, I think, is just under 25 years. The average age of ferries in Shetland and Orkney is significantly older than that, well over 30 in the case of Shetland, I know, and probably similar here. And it isn't, you know, it's partly about the tourist who can't go somewhere, but sometimes it's about the kid that can't get to school.
Yeah, of course it is.
Or the somebody who can't get to their doctor's appointment. And I think that, you know, the UK is incredibly centralised in London and the southeast, and Scotland is incredibly centralised in the central belt, and we focus infrastructure spend on where we think we can get a cheap and quick return on financial investment, not where we can get a return on social investment. If this was, you know, we're sitting here right in front of a Nordic flag, right? If we compare ourselves to other Nordic countries, we're not just talking here about, oh, we need a new ferry here. You're talking about bridges, tunnels, massive infrastructure investment, and constant infrastructure investment. And it's not just about cutting the ribbon on a shiny tunnel, it's actually about repopulation. Because what you find, especially in the Faroes, which is probably the best example of it, every time they tunnel to a remote island, that remote island repopulates. And it's not even a discussion anymore. That's just what happens all the time in these places. We are so incredibly centralised, and more importantly, we're unbelievably unambitious. And if you don't start physically connecting these places, you can just forget about repopulating it. It just won't happen.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with what Andy says in terms of opening up that discussion around fixed links, whether it's tunnels or whether it's bridges. I just wanted to go back to the point about accessibility, because even when the ferries are running, even when the Inter-Isles Air Service operates, there are residents of those islands who cannot access those ferries. I mean, they don't need to necessarily be in a wheelchair. Any kind of mobility issue that you have, you will find that these are ferries that were designed in a different age. The Disability Discrimination Act was a glint in the eye of some Labour minister yet to be appointed. But that is now having an effect where certainly I can think of a couple of islands in Orkney where we have residents now who are effectively isolated on their island, in their home, unable even to get in for routine medical appointments because they can't get on the plane, they can't get into the onto the ferry. So this is something where it's, as Andy says, the average age of the vessels now is beyond what we see on the West Coast, and I think it is a feather in the cap of the Orkney Ferries crew that they keep these blooming vessels going in the way that they do under those circumstances.
Yeah, look, I think this is really important, and I think actually one of the things that's really important to focus in is this isn't just about inconvenience. This isn't just that it takes a bit longer. It actually has very real and material costs. So when I was travelling about Orkney today, it was being pointed out that building materials cost 30% more here for building projects than they do on the mainland, and actually on the outer, some of the outlying islands, is 20% on top of that again. That's because of infrastructure. So when you have materials costing more, you are literally impoverishing the people that live here because of the infrastructure links. So I mean, infrastructure is one of these words. It's not very glamorous. It's not, doesn't set the heather alight politically, but it is really fundamental, which is why we really need to look very carefully at what has happened with our ferry building. The fact that I think the oldest CalMac ferry was launched in 1982. I think the oldest ferry service in these islands, I think, is older than me. I think somebody was telling me today it was in the mid-70s. The ferry scandal that Scotland's been facing isn't the 2 ferries that we've not completed. It's the fact that we haven't had a consistent ferry building programme over the last 2 or 3 decades. And the failure to do that has impoverished outlying islands and people right the way across Scotland.
We'll hear from Ivan in just a mo, because I want to bring in Christopher Leask, who's a councillor here in Kirkwall West, I believe, Christopher. And you're also the local chair of the Development and Infrastructure Committee on Orkney Islands Council. And I'm just interested for your take on, I suppose, the relationship between what you do on that committee and what MSPs talk about and what the government kind of delivers.
Sure, so I think that on ferry replacement, I mean, that is a long-running issue. It well predates my involvement in politics, frankly. And it's really our council leader, Heather Woodbridge, who admirably leads on that and follows on from successive councils' work on that, as well as support from others. I mean, chiefly Liam amongst them, who have continually been working on the issue. Where we're at now, I think, is very positive. We have a positive relationship with Scottish Government, a positive working group with them. We're getting funding to actually build up a replacement case to look at all the technical analysis that we need to do for the replacement of our ferries. And we even have some electric e-foil ferries coming over the winter and into next year, which is really exciting. So things are moving forward, and I think that's not been the feeling in Orkney in the past, within local government in the past. So it does seem like a sort of new dawn, if you will, in terms of making progress on it.
Let's grab a word from Ivan.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely recognise the importance of the ferry fleet and the age of the ferries. The points that's just been made about the work the Scottish Government is doing with Council here and elsewhere on the inter-island replacement is important to recognise investment and the business case to start that investment happening. And if you reflect back, like 2007, Scottish Government's put £2 billion into the ferry system across Scotland. Now you can argue it should be more than that, it should be higher, there should be more investment. 6 new vessels obviously coming on stream across the next 2 years or so. So there is investment there. You can always say that there could be more, of course you could, right? But I think that positive working relationship with the local council to understand how we take that forward and deal with that is important. And the point that Liam makes about it's a long-standing issue. This isn't just something that's happened in the last few years. It's been a long-standing strategic issue that's needed to be addressed.
And I think, and honestly, the honesty our 3 politicians are showing is pretty respectable and commendable, actually, because we don't always get this on the podcast. We usually get the party lines to take, and I really appreciate the candour. But we've got to be creative, surely. You know, we have the Chancellor just yesterday quoted as saying more difficult decisions need to be taken on public spending. We know that interrelates with how much money through Barnett consequentials the Scottish Government will get. All discuss and debate the economics of Scottish and UK politics. But the point is this. I think whatever view you take, there's going to be less money to go around, right? Public money. So the answer cannot always lie with governments and councils, because it's going to be a tough time. We're dealing still in the aftermath of the COVID crisis and the cost of living crisis that precipitated. So, you know, going back to our first conversation, we need to be creative. Where is the finance going to come from? We need to start thinking. Andy mentioned this word rules. Rules from the Scottish Government, rules from the UK Government. Incentivise, in fact, bloody force some of those with deep pockets, whether they're developers about to build transmission stations, substations, or pylons, or whether they're going to benefit from our deep water ports that we're creating, get them to foot the bill for some of this stuff. That is how a lot of the Nordic countries have done this, particularly in Norway. We need to be more creative in terms of how we finance this stuff, because we are miles off being able to build bridges and tunnels between our islands. How can the Faroe Islands do it? Look at the models. How have they done it? Bring the private sector with you and say, if you want to be part and a benefit from our economy, you've got to contribute to our communities in which that will impact. And we need to be better at this, and we haven't done it in generations.
And the answer is it's built with private finance and it's told. That's how you do it. I mean, that's how they do it. You're totally right. If we're sitting here saying, not really got enough this year from tax receipts, you know, I mean, you're just on a hiding to nothing. We're going to get absolutely nowhere if we're not creative with how we're actually raising money and where we're leveraging finance from. It just won't happen. And it doesn't happen anywhere else in Europe either, by the way.
Look, I think that's an entirely fair point, and I think we've learnt the hard way. I said before that some communities got screwed to the ground by early developments in onshore wind. I think there was an inequality of arms in terms of the discussions that were taking place, and the communities got taken for a ride, and I think over time they've learned. I think governments have gone through that as well, and I know that in the early stages of the PPP and PFI, that we were seeing governments locked into contracts that were so heavily weighted invested on the side of the private sector. I think that process has got to a stage now where there is more equality of arms, but it needs a responsible private sector. You can set the rules, but you need a private sector that is invested in and engaged with what are the longer term outcomes that need to be seen here in the development, sustaining of communities and the building of economies.
And again, I think the other thing is to recognise some of the opportunities which are coming. So if we are going to shift from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, there's all sorts of forms of taxation which are just going to disappear. Primarily the tax that we pay every time we fill up our cars with petrol or diesel. So something's going to have to replace that. So I think there is going to have to be a discussion about, well, what replaces that tax. Now, I'm not going to sit here, and as candid as a discussion as this is, and come up with that. But I think there's an opportunity, and we should have a public dialogue, because you can't ignore what has been built in the Faroe Islands and the model that has done. And it has built connectivity for those islands, which I think, frankly, most people in Scotland look on with envy. But there are also other sources of finance, perhaps not for road infrastructure, but I mean, our pension industry is potentially a source. I mean, they're crying out for investable opportunities. I have discussions with that sector practically on a weekly basis, certainly on a monthly basis, saying, look, you just need to shape things like housing, potentially other bits of infrastructure like heat networks in the right way, because we want to invest. The crazy thing is we are in ports, absolutely ports. We want to invest, and indeed we're investing in these things, but just not in Scotland. We're doing it in the Nordic countries. So we need to look at that, because and we need to look broadly. And to be fair, I think the Scottish Government doing this, certainly the incoming Labour Government, that these are some of the things which are front and centre of things like the National Council for Infrastructure, National Wealth Fund, GB Energy, which is seeking to do things in a different way, in partnership, leveraging private finance, but in partnership with the state.
Really interesting. Shall we sort of mould ourselves into a sort of slightly separate topic? All of these things, I feel, are quite connected, is probably what we're getting at. And Geoff's point there is actually to see them as connected, because that actually is probably the way to work towards solutions. And by the way, just at this point, if you've got questions, points that you want to raise at any point, just raise your hand, catch my eye, whatever, and we'll get you on the podcast as well. We've touched a little bit on population already this evening, just by way of considering where Orkney stands when it comes to skills and jobs and young people and old people, indeed, in all of this. I was digging out the stats, actually, so bear with me while I give you some of the data just for context. So between 2001 and 2020, Orkney's population
17%. I did my homework.
As a whole, grew at a faster rate than any other so-called data zone. So these are things like individual islands, island areas, or island groupings. This is according to the Scottish Parliament Information Centre. The National Records of Scotland data shows that from 2010 to 2021, many of Orkney's outer islands saw their collective population decline. And in terms of demographics, the 45 to 64 age group was the largest in 2021. The 16 to 24 age group was the smallest. The average age of the population of the Orkney Islands is projected to increase as the baby boomer generation ages and more people are expected to live longer. Right? These are the headline numbers. Andy, can you help us put that into some sort of context as to what that means? Again, challenges and opportunities is what we're discussing tonight.
Yeah, and I mentioned before about the similarities between the three groups of islands that we are going to, because actually the similarities are now clearer than they ever were before. Similar populations, but declining populations, young working age people leaving, older people coming in, which is lovely if there are enough young working age people to support them at the other end. Similar industries, similar problems in terms of connectivity. I mean, ultimately, you need the basics to be able to sustain a growing working population. You need something to do, so you need jobs, good jobs, not just public sector jobs, good private sector jobs. We're about to speak to Scottish Sea Farms, talk about good private sector jobs. That's what they are. You need somewhere to stay. Massive problem in all the island groups in terms of housing. It's very expensive to build housing. I mean, these are other things that are not appreciated really, I think, in the Central Belt, is actually how much more expensive it is to do really similar things up here than it is down there. And you need to be able to get here. I mean, sitting watching the closing ceremony of the Olympics last night, and Rachel said she'd quite like to take a wee trip to Paris with the kids soon.
Rachel is Andy's wife, by the way.
Yes. They probably got that.
Well,
And so I had a look on Skyscanner, an amazing Scottish success story. I can get all 6 of us, I've got 4 children, as you know, I can get 6 of us to Paris for just under £600. I got here myself for over £500.
But we're
Just
charging
me.
it on the podcast.
Right?
You know, we didn't pay anything, really.
I mean, there are just really obvious barriers to being able to conduct the same sort of life further away from the central belt than we realise when we're there. So we've got to put these things in place. But as we've said many times before, and we said it, I think, in response to one of the councillors in Stornoway, actually, who asked the question at the end. I think places like the Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland need to start to flip the narrative a little bit and understand just the scale of power that they are about to have for the remainder of this century, because in many cases, places like this are holding the cards.
I think, there's a truism here that population follows power when you strip it right back. And what you're articulating, I think Orkney's probably the only island group that's not had a decline in population in recent years. It's actually done slightly better than other island groups, and I think part of that possibly because of the energy work that's been happening here. But it's about, this is a phenomenon that's been obviously a Scottish phenomenon for 200 years or more, right? Scotland's population as a percentage of the UK total 200 years ago, I think, was close to 20%. Now it's 8.5% or whatever it is. And that's been going down decade by decade with very little interruption. So it's not just an island problem, it's a Scotland-wide problem, and that ageing demographic, absolutely the same issue. So it's about how you attract people in. Now, go there, but Brexit clearly hasn't helped, but despite that, we've still got to do what we can. Making Scotland and the islands in particular more attractive for people from the rest of the UK, I think, is important.
So what does that mean? Should Orkney have control over its own immigration policy, for example? What are we talking about here?
We do. We just let you in. Whether we let you out is another question.
I'm happy to stay.
That's
no problem with that.
That's
an
interesting. Well, certainly, we've argued that Scotland should have its own immigration policy as part of the UK, even if we're not fully independent. And within that, yeah, absolutely. Why wouldn't you look at developing that further? Okay. But I think
so
just following on from that, there's work happening that I'm taking forward in terms of Single Island Authority. We're talking to Argyll and Bute about that. We're talking to the Western Isles about that. We're talking to Orkney about that. How you give more coordination at a local level between public services, so as the council's leading on much more of that rather than it being centralised.
That is
hugely important.
That is really, but the centralisation. I mean, it's pretty clear to me, I think, that devolution stopped at Holyrood, and actually power got taken from London to Holyrood, but also got sucked up from local authorities to Holyrood as well. I mean, is there a potential for an incoming SNP government in 2026 to say, look, we've got to reverse the balance of power here? Because it isn't all about immigration powers, it's about a lot of other powers as well, and giving places like this the freedom to do things differently because we're very far away from Edinburgh. And
the work that's happening at the moment is all about that. How do you get more of those local services that are delivered through other agencies, delegated effectively, or working that single authority model, so that the local authorities got much more control and say over those.
Daniel, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so look, the ageing population point is actually, I think, one of the things that we need to talk a lot more about. Actually, I seem to be coming up with lots of things that we need to be talking a lot more about. But
plenty podcasts.
I mean, it's up there with climate change and technology change, demographics, and it's not just a Scottish thing. The world population growth has halved since the 1970s. It's going to halve again by the middle of this century. So, this is something that everywhere around the world is going to have to face, but at different times. So, look, I think that requires us to think some quite profound thoughts about the nature of work.
Have you got any to share with us tonight?
So look, so for example, I think one of the things is, for one of my observations is this: middle class professional people will quite often carry on beyond retirement age, doing consultancy work, nice work if you can get it. But there's a sort of assumption there that other people don't have skills, experience to keep imparting. I wonder if there are things that we can do to ensure that we retain that experience in the workforce, not full-time work, i.e., could we look at things about the way where we don't just lose people from the workforce just because they hit a particular age? And certainly other countries, so in Denmark, for example, now I'm not advocating this, but it's interesting, they've now set the retirement age at 15 years less than average life expectancy, so that it tracks. You know, i.e., we're going to have to think radical thoughts, both in terms of the nature of work, nature of retirement, the balance between these things. But the other thing, can I just say, these are the big thoughts. There's also the really basic thing, which is housing. You know, we have a housing problem right the way across Scotland, but particularly in our rural communities. We are building houses at historically low rates on a national average, and that affects rural populations, communities, far more acutely than anywhere else.
Just very briefly, if I may, on thinking radical, Daniel, and Ivan mentioned the SNP want to have control over immigration policy. Jack McConnell, through the Fresh Start initiative, recognised this when he was First Minister, and there was that pilot scheme in place, which was pretty successful until we moved to the migration point system. But now we're out with the European Union. You know, can you two agree right now that who's ever in power after 2026, you're going to try and devolve that, emulate the Jack McConnell experience, and try and bring more people here? It's not going to answer all our ills. I don't want to ever suggest that. But surely that's the type of radical thinking that we need.
Look, I think that's easy. On a previous podcast during the election campaign,
yes.
I said with Kate Forbes, I think Fresh Start worked, and I think we should look at what the lessons are and see whether or not.
So we've got a deal. We've made policy tonight in Orkney.
But we're in danger of thinking we've solved the issue, because I think, at a time where net immigration to the UK is as high as it is, there's serious questions about why a significantly larger proportion of that net immigration isn't gravitating or even staying in Scotland. I mean, Fresh Talent was an excellent initiative, but its weakness was that once you got beyond the X number of years after graduation, what were you going to do? Were you, like so many other young Scots, going to gravitate down towards London and the South East for jobs and careers?
And that's where I think Andy's point comes in about local control. There has to be there has to be an element of local authority saying that you must be working in a certain sector for years with local authority. We need to think creatively about this. We do not have the people or the skills for the future energies industries that we're talking about, including green energy, and therefore I think we need all of you guys.
Let's be careful. We can't populate our planning departments and our roads departments having local immigration officials as well. It's setting up more burden on local authorities.
I think you're all misunderstanding it, because you haven't accounted for the fact that James Cleverly's Conservative Party are going to win the next election anyway. It doesn't matter what these guys think.
Okay, fair enough.
Do you know, there's an interesting point though. Fergus Ewing, several months ago in Parliament, suggested that doctors who are trained in Scotland should be made, actually, after graduation, to work in some of the most remote rural parts of Scotland, and that's just part of the deal. And as a result of that, any debt or fees or whatever that they've built up could be forgiven in a gradual kind of scheme.
Okay, let's have an incentive scheme, but let's not move disgruntled doctors into the Isles to serve time. Okay, in a sense, what you want is people living and working in the Highlands that want to be there. Yeah. And it takes a particular mindset, and very often, like Kat, you're born here, you're brought up here, you have a connection here, you are more likely to want to gravitate back. So how do we make that easier, rather than just say, across the population of graduating doctors, we are going to kind of mass migrate you in a forced way?
You don't want a grumpy doctor, do you?
Maybe we could get Fergus Ewing just to hector young people into understanding the responsibilities.
That might work.
Where they come from.
I mean, he hectors other people very effectively, doesn't he?
Sorry, Calum, Ivan did want to come in on that.
Yeah, so
just
very
quickly,
point I was going to make was on the data point. It's quite important. If you look back over the last few years, the number of people coming from the rest of the UK to Scotland has been significantly higher than the number of people moving from Scotland to the rest of the UK. So to some extent that balance has started to shift, but I think there's an awful lot more we could do in that space to encourage and support people making that journey.
Okay, thank you. By my maths, we've probably got about 10 minutes left of our podcast episode here in Kirkwall this evening. We've been touching on housing. I just want to get a perspective on housing from Jenny Rambridge, who's here with us this evening. She's the chair of Hope Co-Housing. Jenny, thank you so much for being here. First of all, I think just explain what the work is that you do.
We're working to establish a small co-housing organisation, which is a new development, and it's a new departure, and co-housing is not well known at all, but interestingly is becoming more popular, and we are hoping to establish a small community which is to scale for our island village down in South Walensea, and we are at the point where we've got planning permission, we're ready to build, we're, as we say, shovel ready. We now have to get the finance together, and that is proving a big problem. There's been a lot of talk about financing issues. Where does it come from? How is the Scottish Government going to help with resolving the issue it's got between all these projects that are being developed and the need for housing and the fact that the financing simply doesn't stack up?
It's really interesting. So you're having sort of, you know, the practicality on the ground is you're ready, the policy issue is the hold-up.
The finance is the hold-up, and the financing of, particularly in this case, okay, when it's not social housing on the Central Belt scale or on the Central Belt model, we're looking for development of community-led housing, and community-led housing is, I think, one of the answers for rural and island communities. They're small developments. They're developed by people who are living there. They're people who want to stay in their communities. But the financing is really, really difficult, and we need a structural change.
One of the things you said when we were speaking about this was about how budgets work, and they're all in silos, and the government can't seem to kind of work across budgets.
Yeah, well, my particular interest is in a senior co-housing, so I'm very interested also on the aspect of the aging demographic. And one of the arguments that we have to make is that if you house people in accessible, warm, comfortable housing, which is a good standard, rather than the cold, old, lonely houses that they're living in, then they will benefit for their health, it will benefit the communities, it will benefit, well, it'll benefit pretty much everybody, but it helps those people to live a longer, active old age. But if you talk to people, there's the housing budgets here, and then there's the health budget there. They don't ever seem to cross over. There doesn't ever seem to be any opportunity to say, this is a big issue, this is a holistic issue. Can it not have a holistic solution?
Enjoy the kind of very real world practical example of that. Just while I'm out and about, there was other people that wanted to kind of come in on the conversation that we were just having. Let me meander over here. Hello, who are you?
Hi there, Neil Kermode. I work for the EMEC, which is the European Marine Energy Centre. We're working on wave and tidal energy. And there are several points that have been very interesting tonight. One of the pieces that keeps coming back to, in my mind, is the fact of the lack of vision of where Scotland could be. And the point was about being remarkably unambitious. And I'm not sure who said that, but I've written it on my pad.
I'm taking it. It's me.
You can have it. It's all yours. But the other point that Geoff made was about the need for areas to join up and the ports to work together. And what's happened recently is Orkney has got big proposals for what could be done in terms of renewables, but we are set off against the other ports to work against them. And that seems ludicrous. That Scotland is small enough to play together, and we need to find a way to incentivise that. And at the moment, we are divided rather than coalescing. And I think a further piece is that people here have said about the worry about industrialisation and the worry about what's in it for us. And there isn't really anybody who is selling the message. Now, from the inside, looking at it, we can see there are huge opportunities for Scotland. We don't see that this is going to be an industrialisation process if it's done well. So cables can be buried. There'll be some things which will impact. We could improve our landscape by burying some of our existing cables. There are a lot of things that we could do, but we are at the moment focused very much on the minimum cost rather than the maximum benefit. And it's trying to find a way to illuminate the benefits to allow people to make a judgment, to then realise that what is being talked about is actually for the benefit of Scotland.
I know we need to get on. I just want to echo everything you've just said. The port optimisation piece is massive. It's not happening. Commercial entities working off against each other. Your point about cables, I did mention earlier on in my conversation, a lot of this is subsea. We can do a lot of that already existing. We can augment, and then there's existing pylons as well. So everything you've just said, well said.
Lovely. Thank you for taking part. It's really good to get these real world examples that you guys, the MSPs, the ministers indeed, can take away with you from here. Liam, I know you're acutely aware of lots of these. Shall we talk about fishing? Yes? Good. Let's talk about fishing. Andy, where were you today? Tell us about your day.
Well, actually, I was going to be on a salmon farm today, actually, but and Daniel was going to be on a salmon farm as well, but the weather conspired somewhat against us, and
what can you do?
Our kind sponsors at Scottish Sea Farms decided that they wanted to return us to the mainland alive. So we didn't go to Salmond Farm,
Rare.
but we did go and see Anne and colleagues at Scottish Sea Farms. The technology in this industry is incredible. I think a lot of people don't quite understand the technology that goes into it, and we saw a little bit of that.
The fact that actually, well, nobody could go out and visit the farms. They could feed the fish remotely from a high-tech mission control type situation. I mean, it was very impressive.
Yeah.
Well, let's get Anne. Anne is here. Hello, Anne.
Hello, hi.
How important is this industry to this place, for those who might not be familiar?
So we have 76 employees, so colleagues in Orkney, so 76 homes, 76 families, and a high salary employer. So our entry is 33,000, which is a fairly high number for somebody coming from school. And of course, in terms of career development, I sit here coming from an environmental background. I'm not a farmer as such. My colleague sitting next to me is a vet. We have people very skilled in IT, and of course, as both Daniel and Andy saw earlier, there's hope for those that are worried about gaming children and gamers in terms of their ability to use technology. We're the remote sensing and artificial intelligence, data rich. So we're not just farmers as in terms of the traditional term, but the use of new technologies is inherent to the success of the sector going forward, and the potential around Scotland's waters, but particularly around Orkney and the islands, is huge, and we're not tapping into it.
That brings me on to, again, just our challenges and opportunities sort of question and theme tonight. How do you consider those two things?
Well, I think everything that's been said, I can only just say yes, and incredibly frustrating, as a member of the salmon sector, to be travelling in those tunnels, to be connecting, and visiting places and seeing the growth of the communities in some of these remote islands, and knowing that it's not very difficult to copy the best elements of others and to bring that into play. I think ultimately the challenge we have very much is around that energy of the future. So of course everything, I'm talking about, and we were talking about broadband access to power on farms, and the remote nature of farming in the sea, and the ability for it to be even remoter actually means that there's a huge growth potential. But you can't have a farm without farmers, and you can't have farmers without homes. And that infrastructure and that connectivity, I think for me, we struggle to have colleagues who come into the sector to stay if they're too remote from others, if they're too disconnected. And of course, very keen to open up and increase population across remote islands. But it is go back to that basic infrastructure. And for me, the connection between sectors, we're talking about ports there. My goodness, you should see the size of some of the boats we've got coming along. We need harbours and ports, and we don't need two of everything. We just need some really good ones. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that the salmon farming sector is an incredible sector for Scotland because up with whisky, you're talking about a very iconic Scottish product, very low carbon protein. Excellent private sector jobs, often in some remote communities the biggest private sector employer, sometimes the biggest employer, full stop. And it's an industry that this industry should be loved. It shouldn't just be tolerated like it sometimes is in some parts of the country. It should be loved. Forget about trade unions coming in for beer and sandwiches. There should be a meeting at Butte House every single month with smoked salmon and Kirkwall gin and tonics from the Orkney distillery. This is an industry that should be loved, and we all, I think, have a compulsion to ask ourselves the question of why we don't love this industry as much as we do. I think it's a shared blame. I think politicians do not adequately understand how important the industry is. And I think the industry has often not done itself really any favours either over the last little while. But any other country that has this unique industry would say, what can we do to make you bigger and better and more successful for all of us? And we don't ask that question here.
Yeah, I think the importance of the sector, you're absolutely correct. I certainly recognise that. I remember sitting at dinner in Oslo when I was early years as being a minister with a number of the investors in the sector, and the chat was about Scottish waters being the best waters in the world for salmon farming because of where it is, the temperature gradient and so on and so forth, and we have to make sure we maximise that opportunity. If you were to look for a sector, possibly outside of energy, but certainly a sector where you could dramatically increase the export value to the economy relatively quickly, then it's the salmon sector. And we are, if you look at the big three in Norway, Chile and ourselves, we are not keeping pace. We're growing, but not growing as fast as they are. So there's huge potential on the world stage. And just to echo the point on technology, not just in terms of how the farms are operated, but also in tackling head-on a lot of the environmental and other challenges that are there, is really coming on significantly.
I mean, I'd just pick up where Ivan left off. I mean, I think it's absolutely right. This is a success story. We need to support that success story, but we need to provide the challenge you would expect as well. The reason that we have the brand reputation we have is because it's seen as a challenging regulatory environment. And as soon as it's not, I think some of the benefits that Ivan's been talking about in terms of the quality of the waters and indeed through to the point that Ivan was making about the kind of leading edge technology that's coming into the development of the sector, you start to erode some of that. I think some of the debate around the sector has been wholly irresponsible, but I think there's a responsibility on legislators to keep challenging while at the same time recognising the success of this sector and the potential for it to grow and to support that growth. I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, I think in somewhere like Orkney, we have the benefit of being a very tight labour market. We've never had really high levels of unemployment over the last couple of decades or so, but that makes it a challenge for employers across all sectors. I think actually the salmon sector, the aquaculture sector, has been quite successful in attracting people into the sector, which in turn has caused knock-on impacts in other parts of the sector. But that's why we need to develop the skills and provide more opportunities for people to remain here, but also to move to Orkney.
Interesting what you say there, because I've come back out into the audience. By the way, it's really nice to listen to you guys from the audience. It's a really lovely experience, even if I do say so myself. Would you introduce yourself for us?
Hi, Stephen Kemp from Orkney Builders. It's really interesting to listen to the discussion about the other sectors that are obviously also in growth, and they're hugely beneficial to all the communities. The aquaculture sector, the renewable energy sector, but one of the big challenges we're having now in the construction sector is competing. We've all got a very small pool of young people that leave school every year, and there's massive competition within our sector, but also with other sectors to get those people to come and work. And we can't, usually in the construction industry, we're kind of in a constrained position, especially with house building, which is my sort of primary output, because we're capped at what people can pay for a property, according to lending. And the problem we've got now is that build costs in Orkney outweigh market value of a property. So we're seeing a massive downturn suddenly in privately funded new housing, because it doesn't matter how big your salary is, you can't get a mortgage in the house. You need a big cash lump sum to build it. And it really comes down to volumetric affordable housing. And we need to find a way to properly build that faster, with less hindrance, to allow us to hit the affordability targets so that the government can even start looking at funding it. And that's something that's really fallen by the wayside. But until we sort that problem, none of the other sectors in Orkney will actually succeed, because we can't keep the people that we need coming in, but also keep the young people here.
I'm quite taken actually by what has emerged all throughout the course of the evening, is how linked all of these things are. And perhaps even in my own thinking, I'm guilty of, when we plan these things, I'm like, this is section 1 and this is section 2 and that's not the reality that we're hearing tonight. That actually,
I know you've made a right mess of it.
But the challenges, the challenges and the opportunities, as we're hearing, are all interconnected, I think is what I'm guessing at. Mm-hmm. Is that valid,
I
Ivan?
think that's absolutely correct, and you see that at every level. And going back to the point I was making before about why it's important that as much of that is devolved to local authorities, so you're able to join that more intelligently at a local level, depending on what the circumstances are. And it's a really important step forward.
I mean, I mean, in essence, what you just outlined there is that is the economy. People need places to live, they need places to work, and the ability to get from where they live to where they need to work, and businesses need to get what they produce to their customers, and they need to get their materials in. That is why these things are all connected. But it's also why, and actually, just to slightly awkwardly, but I think it's important to link this to the salmon point. It's why you need industrial strategy. If you don't have industrial strategy, don't expect these things to happen. And if you don't have industrial strategy, you don't expect your key industries to grow. And let's be clear about salmon. It's our third biggest export, after oil, and then whiskey, and then it's salmon. So what we should be doing is, absolutely there are some things, and sustainability is an issue for all industries, but we need an industrial strategy, government and the industry working together to look through those solutions. Just as we need an industrial strategy in energy, just as we need an industrial strategy, frankly, in housing, where it's really deeply acute.
Very final word, Liam.
I would just say, just linking what Stephen was saying to what Jenny was saying, the housing crisis, essentially, I think that we face here, as I think so many communities around the country are facing at the moment, is largely going to be addressed by trying to address the issues that Stephen pointed to. But the point Jenny makes is absolutely, particularly in an island community, where you've got a fragmentation of those communities. I think we've got a strong sense of communities still in Orkney, but families operate and extended families operate in very different ways now than they once did. So identifying ways, innovative ways in which what you can do is take some of the pressure off public and even the third sector in those supporting and those care roles by allowing people to stay in their home for longer, supporting each other is going to be crucially important. So actually being innovative, there isn't going to be a single solution to any of this. We're going to need to address, as I say, the concerns that Stephen's been talking about for the construction sector, which has a knock-on in terms of the aquaculture sector, the renewable sector and all the rest of it. But we also need to be more creative. It's not just about a numbers game. Population in Orkney is going up, but if you look at some of the outlying islands and some of the rural parishes, you're seeing depopulation there. Yeah. So don't be blinded by the kind of global picture that Orkney is doing well. We're in a good position. Doesn't mean it doesn't come without its challenges.
Really, really fascinating. Thank you for such a constructive and I hope helpful and informative conversation. Liam MacArthur, Ivan McKee and Daniel Johnson. Now, as the sun sets over Kirkwall, we will take just 2 minutes for a closing thought from our resident insiders. Let's start, Geoff, with you. As you reflect on what we've heard over the last 90 minutes or so, here in Kirkwall, what are you thinking?
I really need the toilet, and that's not a joke.
What profundity?
No, look, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Yeah. Stornoway was brilliant. I thought the fact that we had Torquil Crichton, their Labour MP, recently elected, but we've had 2 additional politicians tonight. I'll say again, I thought the way that you approach the subjects, we're not here for gotcha moments. We're here to discuss things in depth. There are clearly a lot of challenges, but there's clearly a lot of opportunities as well. And we gave, I think, good service to both of those, and that's really helped by the audience. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
So my very brief closing thought on a similar sort of theme is that pretty much
the toilet. So we crack each other up.
Oh, sorry. I was going to be slightly more profound.
Focus. I am actually.
Everything that we've talked about tonight, population, infrastructure, these can't be solved in a 4 or 5 year electoral parliamentary term, right? They're all really long term. And if you're going to do something long term, you have to broadly have agreement across the sort of centrist political party spectrum that everybody is heading in the same direction. Might not be identical, might be some nuance, but everybody's pretty much got to agree. That's what they do in the Nordic countries. Everybody's pretty much got to agree on the general direction of travel, because it means you can then take proper long-term decisions without the next person coming in and ripping it all up, and they're not then subject to parliamentary terms. Yeah. And I think what we have seen, there's not been a huge amount of disagreement on the core issues that we all know need addressed. As I say, disagreement on some of the nuances and some of the edges, but there's been widespread agreement on the general way forward. That's what we need to make this all work.
Really, really interesting. Thank you for taking part. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Andy. Most importantly, thank you for showing up, because these events, we love doing this. We love having these conversations. But to hear the real life examples of the challenges and the opportunities. And also, by the way, I think one thing to mention is the passion within communities for making things better. And these people that you, as politicians, have heard from tonight are so plugged in and so engaged and so enthused to capture these challenges and to turn them into opportunities. And I think that is remarkable as well. So thank you very much for being here as part of the Holyrood Sources Islands Tour. We will be in Lerwick next month, we think, probably September, depending on whether my admin skills are up to it. But we'll get there. We'll absolutely be there before the end of October. We promise you that. Thank you so much for having us. We have loved being in Kirkwall. We're very grateful for you giving up your Monday evening. We will talk to you on the podcast very soon. Thanks.